The first shovel of earth felt like a betrayal. It broke the smooth, worn pine of the cabin floor, a floor her grandfather had laid with his own hands 60 years prior. Ilara felt the tremor of the violation in her wrists, a dull ache that traveled up her arms to her shoulders. Dust, smelling of dry rot and ancient memories, puffed into the still air of the room. Beside her, Barrow, a dog whose ancestry was a mix of everything loyal and nothing in particular, lifted his head from his paws. His brown eyes, deep and knowing, watched her without judgment. He gave a low sigh, a puff of air that stirred the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of late autumn light, then rested his head again. He was a constant, a silent witness to this strange, methodical madness. Ilara scooped the loose dirt and splintered wood into a bucket. This was the center of her home, the space between the small kitchen and the sleeping loft, the place where a family was supposed to gather. She was excavating its heart. On the table, held open by a heavy river stone, was her grandfather's journal. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to a pale brown, but the handwriting was as clear and deliberate as the man himself. His final entry, written a week before the fever took him, was not about crops or weather, but about water. "The seasons are turning liar," he had written. "The rains come hard and fast, or not at all. The creek is a moody friend. A man can live a week without food, but only days without water. A deep well is one answer, but the earth can be fickle. The surest water is what falls from the sky, a gift you must be clever enough to catch and patient enough to keep. A cistern buried in the earth, insulated by the home itself, warmed by the hearth in winter, cooled by the soil in summer. It is the valley's secret heart." She dumped the bucket of dirt onto a canvas sheet spread outside the cabin door. One bucket. She estimated it would take 300 more just to clear the space. Her hands were already tender. She was not a large woman. Her strength was wiry, born of necessity, not brute force. This was a task for 3 strong men, not one grieving girl and her quiet dog. "What in God's name are you doing, girl?" The voice was rough as granite, and it belonged to Silas Blackwood, her nearest neighbor, a man who lived a quarter-mile down the path. He stood with his hands on his hips, his face a roadmap of disapproval. He had known her since she was born, had watched her grow up, and now watched her with the pained expression of a man witnessing a descent into lunacy. Ilara straightened, wiping a smear of dirt from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "I'm digging." "I can see that," Silas grunted, stepping closer but not crossing the threshold, as if her madness might be contagious. "Tearing up a perfectly good floor. For what? Treasure? Your grandfather wasn't the type to bury gold." "I'm putting in a tank," she said quietly. Her voice was small in the vast silence of the valley. Silas squinted, his eyes scanning the hole, the pile of dirt, the journal on the table. He was a practical man, a man who understood fences and fields, who believed in the wisdom of calloused hands and the predictability of the seasons, even when they were unpredictable. He did not believe in secrets buried in the floor. "A tank? What kind of tank?" "A water tank." He stared at her for a long, silent moment. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. Barrow thumped his tail once against the floorboards. Finally, Silas shook his head, a slow, pitying motion. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. You'll have damp in the walls. The floor will be a block of ice come January. Wait until winter. You'll see. Whatever grief has gotten into your head, child, this isn't the way to sweat it out." He was trying to be kind in his gruff, overbearing way. He saw a young woman unmoored by loss, her parents gone years ago in a rock slide, her grandfather just last spring. This destructive act, this tearing apart of her own home, was a symptom. "It'll work," Elara said. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unmovable as the mountain that loomed over their valley. Silas snorted, a sound of pure disbelief. "It'll work you into an early grave is what it'll do. You need to be tending the garden, putting up preserves, not playing in the dirt like a badger. This is a mistake." He turned and walked away without another word, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel path. She watched him go, then picked up the shovel. The wood was smooth and cool against her palms. She drove it into the earth again. This was not a mistake. This was a promise. The days bled into one another, measured not by the sun's arc, but by the growing pile of earth outside her door. Her body learned a new rhythm, the rhythm of labor. Dig, lift, carry, dump, repeat. Her back screamed in protest each morning. Her hands, despite thick leather gloves, were a geography of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. She ate standing up, simple meals of bread and cheese, her muscles too stiff to allow her the comfort of sitting. At night, she would collapse into her bunk, Barrow curled at her feet, his warm weight a small comfort in the vast, aching emptiness of her exhaustion. She dreamed of digging, of the smell of damp soil and the scrape of steel on stone. She hit rock on the fourth day. Not bedrock, but a layer of river stones, packed tight as teeth. Each one had to be pried out with the iron pry bar she found in the old barn, a tool that felt impossibly heavy. The work slowed to a crawl. For every foot of depth, she paid with a full day of sweat and strained muscles. The hole grew, a perfect rectangle 6 feet deep, 10 feet long, 4 feet wide. It consumed the center of her home. To get from the door to the kitchen, she had to walk a narrow plank she'd laid across the void. The community, small and tightly woven, watched from a distance. Mrs. Gable, whose kindness was as legendary as her blackberry pies, stopped by with a casserole dish covered in a checkered cloth. She clucked her tongue at the state of the cabin, the dust coating every surface, the chasm in the floor. "Elara, dear," she said, her voice soft with concern. "Silas told me what you were doing. This isn't healthy. A home is meant to be a comfort, not a quarry. Let the menfolk help you fill it back in." "I'm almost done with the digging," Elara replied, accepting the casserole. Her hands were so dirty she was ashamed to touch the clean cloth. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. This is very kind." "Kindness isn't going to keep you warm this winter," the older woman said, her eyes full of a gentle sorrow. She saw a girl lost, and she did not know how to find her. Elara just nodded. There were no words to explain the certainty she felt, a certainty inherited from the faded ink in her grandfather's journal. He had been a quiet man, an observer. He saw patterns others missed, the way the birds flew before a storm, the way the moss grew thicker on the north side of the trees, the slow, almost imperceptible drying of the valley over his lifetime. His plan was not madness, it was foresight. It was a legacy of careful observation, and she was its executor. She finished the pit at the end of the second week. Standing at the edge, looking down into the dark, rectangular hole, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It was a wound in her home, but it was a deliberate one. It had purpose. Barrow came and peered into the darkness beside her, whining softly, as if to ask if her work was finally done. "Not yet," she whispered, stroking his head. Now the hard part begins. The journey to town was 20 miles of rutted track that passed for a road. She hitched up her grandfather's old mule, Bess, to the flatbed wagon. The mule was as old and stubborn as Silas, but she was reliable. The trip took the better part of a day. The town of Havenwood was little more than a wide spot in the road, with a general store, a post office, and a blacksmith. Mr. Henderson, who owned the store, was a man whose opinions were as neatly stacked as the cans on his shelves. He watched from his porch as Alara pulled up, tying Bess to the hitching post. "Morning, Alara. Come for supplies?" "I need to order something, Mr. Henderson." "Order away," he said with a benevolent smile. He was a pillar of the community, which meant he felt a certain ownership of its inhabitants' well-being. "I need a 300-gallon galvanized steel water tank." Henderson's smile faltered. He took a pair of spectacles from his vest pocket and polished them on his apron before perching them on his nose, as if a clearer view might make her request make more sense. 300 gallons? That's a stock tank. Planning on raising cattle?" "No, sir. It's for the cabin." He stared at her over the top of his spectacles. The silence stretched. Behind him, the bell on the store's door jingled as another customer entered. "For inside the cabin?" "Under it," she corrected gently. "Under the floor." The news of her project had clearly reached town. Henderson's expression shifted from confusion to the same weary pity she'd seen in Silas and Mrs. Gable. "Alara, I heard you were making some changes at the old place. I can order the tank for you. It'll cost you $17, freight included. But are you sure? That's a lot of money to spend on, well, on a hole in the floor." "I'm sure," she said, counting out the worn bills and placing them on the counter. The money was a significant portion of what her grandfather had left her. It felt as heavy as the water it would one day hold. "It'll be here in 2 weeks, Henderson said, writing down the order with a sigh. He was selling her the instrument of her own folly, and it clearly pained him. The 2 weeks of waiting were not idle. Alara lined the bottom of the pit with 3 inches of fine sand, a foundation she leveled with a straight board until it was as flat as a tabletop. Then she began the plumbing. She climbed onto the roof and cleaned the gutters, her hands scraping out years of accumulated pine needles and leaves. She rerouted the downspout, cutting and fitting sections of tin pipe, soldering the joints with a hot iron until they were seamless. The pipe ran down the side of the cabin and through a newly drilled hole in the wall, ending just above the pit. She installed a simple mesh filter over the intake to keep debris out and a diverter valve for when the tank was full. It was precise, meticulous work, and she lost herself in it. Each successful solder, each tight joint, was a small victory against the chorus of doubt that echoed in her memory. Liam O'Connell found her there, perched on the roof, her face smudged with soot. He was a newer arrival to the valley, a young man who had bought the old Miller place and was trying to make a go of it. He was quiet like her, a watcher, and the town hadn't quite figured him out yet. He didn't mock or offer pity. He just stood at the base of the ladder, holding a small basket of late-season apples, and watched her work. "That's a clever design," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Gravity feed. Simple. Less to break." Alara stopped working, surprised. It was the first time anyone had looked at her project and seen ingenuity instead of insanity. She carefully made her way down the ladder. "Thank you," she said, accepting the basket. Barrow, who was usually wary of strangers, trotted over and nudged Liam's hand. "Need a hand with any of it?" he asked, looking from the new pipe to the canvas-covered hole. "Whatever you're putting in there, it looks heavy." "I have a plan," she said. It was her standard response, a polite wall she'd built around herself. This project was hers alone. It felt too personal, too deeply connected to her grandfather, to share the labor. Liam nodded, understanding her need for solitude without taking offense. "All right, but the offer stands. My well is deep if you ever need it." He smiled, a small, genuine expression. "And apples are good for keeping your strength up." He left as quietly as he had arrived. Ilara watched him go, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. It was a strange feeling to be seen. The tank arrived on a freight wagon, a massive silver cylinder that gleamed in the autumn sun. Getting it off the wagon and to her cabin was an ordeal that involved ramps, ropes, and Bess's grudging cooperation. The final challenge was lowering it into the pit. Her plan, which had seemed so clear in her mind, was a terrifying thing to put into practice. She built a tripod of thick logs over the hole, rigged a block and tackle, and wrapped heavy canvas straps around the tank. Inch by agonizing inch, she lowered the 300-pound steel vessel into the earth. The ropes groaned, the tripod creaked, and her own muscles burned with the strain. Barrow watched from the doorway, whining with every shudder of the apparatus. When the tank finally settled onto its sandbed with a soft thud, Ilara collapsed against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. It was in. The heart was in place. Now, she had to rebuild the body around it. She laid new floor joists over the tank, leaving a small framed access hatch directly above the tank's main port. She laid the pine floorboards back down, their familiar pattern a comfort, knitting the wound in her home closed. All that remained was the hearth. This was the final, crucial piece of her grandfather's design. It was not just a fireplace, it was an engine. She hauled stones from the creek bed, stones worn smooth by centuries of water. She mixed mortar with sand and lime, her hands raw and chapped from the caustic mixture. Stone by stone, she built a massive hearth directly over the buried tank. The base was 3 feet thick, a solid mass of stone and mortar that would act as a heat sink. The firebox was deep, the chimney drew perfectly. The journal was specific. The fire warms the stone warms the earth warms the water. It will never freeze. The warmth of your home becomes the protection for your life's most precious resource. She finished the last stone as the first snow of winter began to fall, fat, wet flakes that melted on the ground. She stood back, her work complete. The cabin was whole again, but transformed. In its center stood the hearth, a silent, stony monument to her labor. That night, she built the first fire. The flames licked at the dry kindling, then roared to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She sat before it, Barrow's head in her lap, and felt the deep, penetrating warmth seep not just from the fire, but from the stones themselves. Silas had been wrong. The floor was not a block of ice. It was the warmest part of the house. Winter came in earnest, blanketing the valley in a deep, silent white. The hearth was a constant, steady source of warmth. Ilara felt a quiet satisfaction. The first part of her grandfather's theory had been proven correct. Now, all she could do was wait for the rains to come and fill the tank. But the winter was oddly dry. The snows were light and powdery, and the spring thaw was less a flood and more a gentle trickle. The creek, usually a raging torrent in April, was merely a cheerful brook. The rains of May never arrived. The sky remained a vast, empty blue, day after day. The sun grew hotter, baking the moisture from the ground. The valley, usually a riot of green, took on a pale, thirsty look. By June, the farmers were starting to worry. Their rain barrels were empty, their shallow wells growing shallow still. The creek slowed to a crawl. It was the beginning of the drought. The first month was a worry. The second was a fear. By the third, it was a quiet panic. The sun was relentless, a merciless eye in a cloudless sky. The earth of the valley floor, once rich and dark, was now the color of dust, cracked into a mosaic of thirst. The leaves on the trees curled and grew brittle, their green fading to a sickly yellow-brown. The cheerful brook that was once the valley creek vanished, leaving a scar of dry, bleached stones. The community well, located in the center of the small village, became the valley's lifeline. Mr. Henderson organized a strict rationing system, 2 buckets per family, per day. It was enough for drinking and a little cooking, but not for washing, not for gardens, and certainly not for livestock. Tempers grew as short as the water supply. Neighbors who had shared harvests for generations now eyed each other's buckets with suspicion. Ilara adhered to the rationing like everyone else. Each morning, she walked to the well with her 2 buckets, filled them, and walked back. No one knew that beneath her hearth, 300 gallons of clean, cool water lay waiting. The spring had been dry, but there had been a few good downpours, enough to fill her tank nearly to the brim. She had opened the small brass spigot she'd installed in the base of the hearth just once to test it. The water that flowed out was sweet and clear. She had turned it off and not touched it since. It was her secret, her insurance policy, a promise she had kept to a ghost. Silas stopped by one afternoon in late July. The disapproval was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, weary anxiety. His own well, one of the most reliable in the valley, was sputtering. He didn't mention her project. He talked about the weather, about the old-timers' predictions, about the unrelenting sun. "Never seen a summer like it," he said, looking out at her small garden, where the plants were withered and dying despite her careful doling of her rationed water. "Not in all my 67 years. If we don't get rain soon, I don't know what we'll do. I might lose my cattle." "It'll rain," Ilara said, though for the first time she wasn't sure she believed it. Liam came by more often. He never asked for anything. He brought her a few tough, drought-stunted vegetables from his garden, which he was managing to keep alive by hauling water from a deep spring high in the hills, a place only he seemed to know about. It was a brutal, back-breaking task. "How are you managing?" he asked, his face etched with concern. "I'm all right," she told him, and it was the truth. She was worried for the valley, for her neighbors, but a quiet calm resided within her. She had prepared. She could endure. By August, the 4th month of the drought, the community well began to fail. The water that came up was muddy, tasting of earth and desperation. The level dropped daily. Mr. Henderson shortened the ration to 1 bucket. People started leaving, packing their wagons and heading for the greener lands over the mountains. The valley was dying. The breaking point came on a blistering afternoon in the first week of September. A crowd had gathered at the well. The bucket came up with nothing but a few inches of brown sludge. It was dry. The silence that fell was more terrifying than any shouting. It was the sound of absolute despair. Mrs. Gable began to cry, quiet, hopeless sobs. Silas stood like a statue, his face gray. Mr. Henderson wrung his hands, his authority vanished along with the water. The carefully constructed fabric of their community was tearing apart at the seams. Ilara, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, turned and walked back to her cabin. Barrow trotted at her heels, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She didn't run. Her steps were as deliberate as they had been when she first broke ground on her floor. She could feel their eyes on her back, wondering where she was going, what a lone girl could possibly do. Liam followed her. "Ilara, what is it?" She didn't answer. She entered her cabin, the interior cool and dark compared to the blinding heat outside. The great stone hearth was the center of the room, a silent, waiting presence. She knelt before it. Behind her, framed in the doorway, the faces of her neighbors appeared. Silas, Mrs. Gable, Mr. Henderson, and a dozen others. They crowded at the door, peering into the gloom, their expressions a mixture of confusion and morbid curiosity. Liam stepped inside. "What are you doing?" Ilara reached down to the base of the hearth, to the small brass spigot almost hidden in the stonework. Her fingers closed around the cool metal. She had imagined this moment for months, through every blister, every aching muscle, every scornful glance. She had thought she would feel triumphant, vindicated. Instead, she just felt a quiet, solemn sense of purpose. She turned the handle. For a moment, there was only a gurgle. Then, with a steady, clear hiss, a stream of water poured out, splashing onto the stone floor. It was not a trickle. It was a confident, generous flow. Cool, clean, and impossibly abundant. It pooled on the floor, a shimmering mirror reflecting the astonished faces in the doorway. The silence from outside was absolute. Barrow, who had been watching her intently, stepped forward and began to lap at the puddle, his tail giving a few slow, happy thumps against the floorboards. It was Silas who broke the spell. He stumbled into the room as if in a trance, his eyes fixed on the impossible stream of water. He knelt, cupped his hands, and drank. He drank deeply, water running down his chin and onto his dusty shirt. He looked up at Ilara, his eyes shining with something she had never seen there before. Awe. "How?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "My grandfather's journal," she said simply. The dam of their composure broke. People surged into the cabin, not with panic, but with a reverent desperation. They brought cups, pots, buckets. Ilara stepped back and let them come. She watched as Mrs. Gable filled a cup and drank, a look of profound relief smoothing the worried lines from her face. She saw Mr. Henderson stare at the hearth, at the spigot, his merchant's mind trying and failing to comprehend the economics of this miracle. Liam stood beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just watched with her. He had been the one person who had looked at her work and seen its logic. His quiet support now felt as vital as the water itself. She organized them. With Liam's help, she established a line. 1 bucket per family, for now. She would not let them drain it in a panic. This water had to last. There was no argument. The authority in her voice was new, forged in solitude and hard labor, and they accepted it without question. They had mocked her, pitied her, dismissed her. Now, she was their salvation, and they knew it. For a week, her cabin was the heart of the valley. Twice a day, at dawn and at dusk, the people would come and line up quietly. Ilara would open the spigot, and they would fill their buckets. She kept a careful tally, marking the level of the tank with a chalk line on the stones. She estimated they had enough for 3 more weeks, maybe 4 if they were careful. It was a lifeline. One evening, after the last person had left, Silas remained. He stood by the hearth, twisting his hat in his gnarled hands. He looked old and humbled. "I was a fool, girl," he said, not looking at her. He was speaking to the stones, to the memory of his own arrogance. "A damn fool. I looked at what you were doing, and all I saw was a crazy girl tearing up her house. I didn't see the sense in it. I didn't see the wisdom." He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "You told me it would work." "Yes," she said. "It worked," he said, the words an admission, an apology, and a testament all in one. "Your grandfather, he was a smart man, and you're his granddaughter."
"All right. You saved us."
He turned and left before she could respond. In the quiet that followed, Ilara felt the true weight of her accomplishment. It wasn't just about being right. It was about the continuation of a legacy, about the quiet, stubborn power of an idea. The drought broke 2 weeks later, in the 5th month, almost to the day. The clouds gathered one afternoon, thick and purple bruised. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of ozone and distant rain. Then the heavens opened. It was not a gentle shower, it was a deluge. Rain hammered on the roof, cascaded down the windows, and turned the dusty paths into muddy rivers. The sound was a roar, a symphony of life returning. The people of the valley stood in the downpour, their faces turned to the sky, laughing and crying as the water washed the dust and despair away. Ilara stood on her porch, Barrow at her side, and watched the gutters overflow. She had switched the diverter valve. The tank was full again. Her secret heart was replenished. The years that followed the Great Drought transformed Havenwood Valley. The story of Ilara's Hearth cistern became a local legend, a cautionary tale about doubt and a parable about preparation. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of construction. Silas Blackwood was the first to come to her, hat in hand, not for water, but for knowledge. "Would you show me?" he asked, his gruffness gone, replaced by a deep, abiding respect. "The plans from your grandfather's journal. I want to build one, for my family." Ilara did more than show him. She brought the journal to his home and helped him stake out the location in his own floor. She taught him how to mix the mortar, how to lay the stones for maximum heat retention. He was a quick study, his hands already wise with the language of wood and stone. When his was finished, Mr. Henderson came, then the Gables, then 2 other families from the far side of the valley. That first year, they built 4 new hearth cisterns. Ilara became a teacher, sharing the simple, profound wisdom her grandfather had left her. She never asked for payment, but her woodshed was always full, her pantry stocked with preserves and smoked meats. Liam was often there, working alongside her, his quiet competence a perfect match for her own. Their partnership, forged in shared labor and mutual respect, deepened into a quiet, steadfast love. They married 2 years after the drought, in a simple ceremony by the creek, which now ran full and clear year-round. The valley thrived. The fear of drought was gone, replaced by a culture of resilience. The hearth cisterns became a standard feature in every new home built, and most old ones were retrofitted. They became a point of pride, a symbol of the valley's hard-won wisdom. Ilara's single act of faith had become the community's bedrock. Time flowed on, as steady as the water from her spigot. Children who had been born after the drought grew up with the story, and they looked at Elara with a kind of reverence. She and Liam raised 2 children of their own in the small cabin, which they expanded carefully, always keeping the original hearth at its center. Barrow grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping on the warm stones of the hearth, the place of his long and patient vigil. One cold winter morning, Elara woke to find him gone. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, his head resting on his paws, facing the fire. She and Liam buried him on the small hill behind the cabin, under a tall pine tree that overlooked the valley. There was no ceremony, just a long, silent moment of farewell to the loyal witness who had been there from the very first shovel of dirt. The loss was a quiet, hollow ache. For so long he had been the keeper of her solitude. His absence made the cabin feel vast and empty for a time. More decades passed. Elara's hair turned the color of snow. Her hands, which had once been raw with blisters, were now knotted with age, but they were still capable. She became the valley's matriarch, its living memory. Young couples came to her not just for advice on building cisterns, but for advice on life. She spoke to them in the same quiet, declarative way she always had. Her words weighted with the patience of a lifetime spent observing, building, and enduring. Liam passed on a bright autumn day, his heart finally giving out after 87 years of steady work. Elara mourned him with the same quiet dignity with which she had lived. She continued to live in the cabin, cared for by her children and grandchildren, a beloved relic from a time of trial. Her own end came as peacefully as Barrow's. She died in her sleep, in her own bed, the faint, familiar warmth of the hearth filling the room. She was 93 years old. The entire valley came to her funeral. They buried her on the hill beside Liam and the pine tree that marked Barrow's grave. Silas, himself an old man leaning heavily on a cane, spoke of a stubborn girl with dirt on her face and an unshakable belief. Mrs. Gable's daughter spoke of a quiet woman whose generosity flowed as freely as the water she had shared. They erected a single, simple stone for her and Liam. It read, "Elara and Liam O'Connell. They taught us to build on stone and to trust the rain." Decades later, long after all who had known the great drought were gone, the cabin still stood. It was preserved by the town, a historic landmark. The hearth, its stones dark with the soot of 100 years of fires, was its centerpiece. A small bronze plaque was affixed to the mantelpiece, telling the story of its construction. A young family was the cabin's caretaker. One hot summer afternoon, their small daughter, thirsty from playing outside, ran into the cool, dark interior. She knew the story by heart. She went to the hearth, her small hands easily finding the worn brass spigot. She turned the handle. A stream of water, cool and clear, poured out. It was a gift from the sky, caught and kept by the earth. A promise made by a quiet man, fulfilled by a stubborn girl, and passed down through the generations. Outside, the sun beat down on the valley. But here, in the heart of the home, there was always water. The legacy was liquid, and it was eternal.